Okay, as a quick follow-up thrusting video, this is going to be a test doing horizontal thrusting, since a few of you were asking about how that looked compared to the drop test. So Oaken, this is for you. This is going to be much less scientific, since I'm just going to be doing kind of hand-powered, arm-powered stabs into the wall. We'll do a couple of them and see what happens. So I get about 2.5 centimeters the first time, about 3 centimeters second time, and about 2.5 on third. That was for the hand doll. And the arming sword. That time I went about 5 centimeters in. 4 centimeters. 5 centimeters for the arming sword. Hanwei Viking sword. A little bit more than 5, I'll call it 5.5. 4. 4. The Viking sword. And for Ronin Katana, number 9. That is 4 centimeters. 4.5. A little bit more than 5, about 5 and a third, 5.3 centimeters. Okay, that's horizontal test. Okay, so now we've had 2 videos on penetration experiments. So let's have a quick discussion, since I neglected to do any analysis last time. We'll put up the measurements for all of the testing we've done so far. And again, I only did a subset this time with the horizontal testing compared to before. But with before, I intentionally went out of my way to try and do a cross-section of a whole bunch of different types of swords. We had a couple of machetes that are less than $100, a couple of mid-range swords. We have swords from Europe, swords from Asia, have a katana thrown in there. So two-handed swords, single-handed swords, swords that are designed from, the time of Christ all the way up to reasonably, much newer designs from thousands of years later. With swords that have different types of edge geometry. So we came up with a decent cross-section, even though the total sample size was reasonably small. And we did end up with variation going on there. Now, in absolute terms, we still have a very limited data pool to draw from, so I'm hesitant to make any really big claims. This is part of the reason why I didn't do any analysis on the first video. I really released the video more as a means of introducing the technique in the hopes that other sword researchers would go ahead and use it, and then we could have a huge amount of data that we can then start to draw inference from. Using my tiny little data set, I might be able to get a couple anecdotal pieces of information, but I'm really hesitant to pin my scientific bona fides on anything just yet. But let's just have a couple of observations and just call it that. These are preliminary observations that need to be further researched, need to have a lot more data done. So just a couple of notes. When I released the video, it looked like, on the clips that I released, I probably showed 2 or 3 drops. In most cases, I was doing drops of 10 or more trials in order to get a larger sample size and create an average number for the depth of each one. So I just didn't take the time to show each and every one. In the future, if there's an actual interest in that, maybe I will show the unabridged, show all 10 plus drops for each blade. It depends. Sometimes the drops, I didn't like the quality of them, so I eliminated them. I pulled them out for whatever reason. Either it went in at an angle or it fell into a pre-existing hole. So there were some times where I determined that wasn't a good drop, and so I discounted it from being counted. But as to the performance of the individual swords, we had several different variables that were going into what made a sword perform well or not well. You had obviously the weight of the sword, which is something that we measured. You can see on the chart the different weights that each of the different swords had. You had the stiffness of the blades, so the ability for the blade to communicate the inertia into the foam once it starts meeting resistance. Some of that energy is going to be lost if the blade starts to wobble or bend. You have the cross section of the blade itself. Is it skinny? Is it wide? Does it have fullers in it, etc.? And of course, you have the tip shape. So that factors into everything has to do with blade geometry. Blade geometry is a really big topic, but that matters quite a bit for it. So obviously the blade that performed least well, perhaps unsurprisingly enough, was the machete. So the Fisker machete, when I dropped it initially under its own weight, when it's a pretty light blade, it didn't even penetrate at all. It's the only blade that, while sharp, it's wide and light, and it failed to go through it all. It just bounced straight off. And even under 2.5 kilograms, it very quickly ran out of ability to penetrate with its very wide front of the blade. They're thin, so the Fisker machete, I think it might only be 2 millimeters wide, maybe even less than that at the very tip. But even with a thin cross section, it's got so much material that it's trying to displace over the width of the blade very quickly. It goes from a reasonably small tip to very quickly widening out, and it is just not meant for being able to penetrate very quickly. At the other extreme, a different type of machete. So the cold steel gladius is not a true gladius. It's a cold steel gladius machete. So it has very little distal taper on it, but it's a much stiffer blade, and it obviously has a much more acute point. And that performed very, very well for a sword that is, I think, $50 retail. Surprise, surprise. The Roman design, even after 2,000 plus years, still does its job quite nicely. So even under its own power, it dropped pretty well, and under weight, it dropped significantly well. So for such a small sword, it was able to penetrate quite deeply with its long, very acute point, much more acute than, I dare say, it probably has the sharper angle and profile than even the arming sword. Not sure. I'd have to do a side-by-side comparison. I will, through the magic of editing, put the measurements between the two here, and you guys will find out if I was right or wrong. So the arming sword seems to have won the contest on the whole, which leaves the other swords kind of in the middle. And I guess we shouldn't be too surprised. So even though it's a Type 14, which is not of all of the medieval swords using the Oakshot typology, that is not by far not the most robust tip. There are many other designs, many other blade configurations that are better at thrusting. This is, if anything, leaning still towards the more cut-centric designs. But it still has a tip that's pretty reinforced compared to some of the other blades we're looking at. And admittedly, my collection on the whole, if anything, biases towards more cutting blades than thrusting blades, which is not going to be unusual for modern collectors who do backyard cutting. This is part of the reason that I came up with this testing to begin with. I want people who are interested in thrust-centric sword designs to have something to fall back on. What about all of our small sword friends? What about someone who's interested in S-Tox? I personally am interested in Tataric sabers from the steppes, the pneumatic sabers that have very long reinforced dagger points that would do very well at this type of a test. But up until this point, how do you evaluate exactly how good something like that is? Almost everyone everyone that I've talked to seems to be very, very surprised at how well the Viking sword did. So the Viking sword is a very wide blade, and most consider it to not be a particularly thrust-centric blade. The fact of the matter is it performed very well. It even outperformed the Jan, I believe, in in most in both configurations. I think I'll have to double check the numbers on that. But even though it didn't have a very acute point, the tip is reasonably thin in cross section, and it's able to displace it. Whereas the machete, while thin and wide, could not. So where's the difference? I think that the difference that we're seeing there comes with the other metrics that I was using, and that's blade flexibility. So whereas the John had a blade flexibility of around 11 kilograms or so, the Viking sword has a flexibility rating of, I think, 22 kilograms. So much stiffer blade. I did not show these testings in the last video, but I also separately tested a kitchen knife and just the head of a spear. So this is a spear from LK Chen that's from the Han Dynasty. It's called the Silver Swallow spear. Both the kitchen knife and the Silver Swallow spear head, when I put 2.5 kilograms on, when I brought them up to 2,500 grams of weight, outperformed any of the swords that I tested. So these two designs outpenetrated any of the sword designs, even though they have very different tips and very different thicknesses. Why is that? I suspect that it has to do with being able to efficiently communicate the force into the target that's being penetrated. So you can talk about a kitchen knife being, very thin and being very pointy, and if we were able to get a sword tip to, since we're only ever talking really about the last, for these tests, we're only talking about 5 to 8 or 9 centimeters anyway. You could talk about making a sword look like that, but the fact of the matter is that a sword is not a scaled up knife. Many expert smiths discuss this. I was talking to James Elmsley recently. He was mentioning how you cannot just have a knife maker take a knife and scale it up to the size of a sword and expect it to perform the same way. A knife will flex at one point. A sword, because of how long it is, will bend like a sine wave in multiple places, and it changes the harmonics, it changes how the hilt is configured, it changes where the force is applied. And I think what's happening is, on a shorter blade like this, that's obviously, in the case of this spearhead, is very, very stiff. I can't get a force reading from the flex test, the Black Fencer flex test, as to how stiff this spearhead is. I could get it from the knife, but the fact of the matter is both of these perform very similarly. I'll put the actual figures up. They outperformed the swords, and they both performed very, very similarly when I put a weight at the end of them. So they're, because of how short they are able to very efficiently translate the weight that I have at the end, the force that's being applied to them, straight through without much loss occurring in the blade, either vibrating or just flat out flexing. And I think that that's what's going on here. So even though you have the very narrow Chu Jian blade at the tip, both the thinness and the narrowness of the tip and the geometry lends itself to penetrating very easily, even with just a very light application of it. Fact of the matter is, the blade is much more flexible than either the arming sword or the Viking sword. And so while the Viking sword has a tip cross section with its width that suggests it shouldn't go deeper than the Jian, I suspect that the stiffness of the blade allows it to transmit that force better, and that's why it's outperforming it. Similarly, the katana is not a particularly good tip. The kisaki at the end of the katana seems to be rather wide, both in thickness and in overall width, but it performs decently. It outperforms some of the other blades that were tested, and I think that that has more to do with the stiffness of the sword than what's going on at the tip. The only way we're going to see if my suspicions are correct is if we do more research. So there will be more data, more swords. I have lots and lots of swords. I might get brave and maybe put one of my antiques. Maybe I'll use that NCO Spadroon and do it if I'm feeling particularly bold. But for the most part, I'd prefer not to damage antiques. But this is the issue: is anytime a sword, because of what we're talking about, how different they are than knives, the physics of any type of an interaction, whether it's a cut or a thrust, interacting with the target, there's all sorts of crazy physics that occur depending on what material you're using and depending on what type of motion is going on, which makes it very, very difficult to model artificially and predict what the outcome is going to be, which is why you have to actually get out there in the grass and do testing. So, what I say to everyone out there who has a sword, go out there, use safe, controlled circumstances, and do your own testing, and come back and share it with the class. Let's see what everyone else has, hopefully using techniques that we can all reproduce, and we will all be the wiser and learn the more from it. All right, until next time, take care.